In the year of our Lord 1348, in a small village nestled between ancient hills that had witnessed 1,000 winters, there lived a truth that pressed itself into the very souls of all who dwelt beneath the grey December sky. The sun, that faithful companion of summer days, seemed to have forgotten the way back to their world, leaving behind only pale promises that lasted mere hours before surrendering to the endless night. Margot pressed her face against the frost-covered window of her cottage, her breath creating small clouds that bloomed and faded like fleeting flowers. Through the thick glass, distorted and bubbled from the village glazier's uncertain skill, she watched the world transform into something alien and beautiful and terrifying. The familiar path to the well had disappeared beneath snow that reached her waist. The oak tree where her children had played in summer now stood like a ghostly sentinel, its branches heavy with ice that chimed like bells when the wind stirred them. The darkness came so early now, creeping across the landscape like a gentle thief who stole the light so gradually that one barely noticed until it was completely gone. By the afternoon hour, when the church bells marked none, the sun hung low and pale, casting shadows that stretched like fingers, reaching for warmth they would never find. The light itself seemed fragile, as if it might shatter at any moment, and leave them in perpetual twilight. Inside the cottage, the hearth fire cast dancing shadows on walls that seemed to press closer each day, as if the cold were physically shrinking their world. Margot's husband, Jean, sat mending a harness by the firelight, his weathered hands moving with the patience of a man who understood that winter was not a season to be rushed through, but endured with steady determination. Their children, Marie and little Pierre, huddled close to the flames, their young faces serious with the knowledge that winter brought responsibilities even to the smallest members of the family. The medieval winter was not merely cold, it was a complete transformation of existence itself. In the long months from November to March, life became something entirely different from the sun-blessed abundance of summer. The very air seemed thicker, harder to breathe, as if winter itself had substance and weight. Frost painted intricate patterns on every surface, creating a world of crystalline beauty that masked the harsh realities beneath. Jean remembered his grandfather's stories of the great winter 40 years past, when the cold had been so severe that wine froze solid in the casks and birds fell from the sky like stones. That winter, old folk said, had lasted until May, and when spring finally returned, it found a changed world. Villages had been abandoned, families scattered to the winds, and the survivors carried in their eyes the particular look of those who had stared into the face of winter and somehow lived to tell the tale. But even in ordinary winters, the challenges were profound. The sun's journey across the sky became a precious commodity, measured and treasured like gold. In the depths of December, daylight lasted perhaps 8 hours, and much of that was the grey half-light that seemed more like twilight than true day. The family rose in darkness and returned to darkness, their lives bookended by the gentle tyranny of night. Margot stirred the pot that hung over their fire, where a thin soup of turnips and barley bubbled slowly. The smell filled their small space with warmth and comfort, a reminder that even in winter's grip, there were still small pleasures to be found. The children breathed in the aroma like a prayer, their eyes bright with anticipation of the evening meal that would warm them from within. Outside, the wind sang its winter song, a low moan that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the earth. It was a sound that medieval people knew intimately, the voice of the season that would be their companion for months to come. Some nights, the wind howled like a living creature in pain. Other nights, it whispered secrets in languages older, than memory. Tonight, it simply sighed, as if it too were weary of the cold and longed for the return of gentler weather. The cottage windows, such as they were, provided little barrier against the winter's assault. Glass was a luxury that few peasant families could afford, and even those who possessed it found their windows covered with ice so thick that the outside world became an abstract painting of white and grey. Most homes relied on wooden shutters and oiled cloth, creating barriers that kept out the worst of the weather while trapping the precious warmth generated by bodies and fire. As the family settled into their evening routine, Margot felt the weight of winter settling around them like a familiar but unwelcome embrace. Tomorrow would bring the same challenges as today: the need to conserve fuel, to ration food, to find ways to stay warm and dry and alive till the sun remembered its way back to their world. But tonight, in the circle of firelight that defined their universe, they had each other, and that was enough. The medieval winter taught patience above all else. It was a season that could not be hurried or bargained with, only endured with grace and determination. As the wind continued its ancient song and the fire settled into glowing coals, the family prepared for another night in the long journey towards spring, carrying within their hearts the quiet faith that the sun, however distant it might seem, had not truly forgotten them after all. The hunger of medieval winter was not the simple emptiness of a missed meal or the manageable discomfort of modern dieting. It was a presence that moved into the bones themselves, settling there like an unwelcome guest who had no intention of leaving. It whispered constantly, a low murmur beneath every thought, every action, every dream that visited the long winter nights. Margot felt it first in her fingertips, the way they seemed always cold now, no matter how close she held them to the fire. The hunger had a way of stealing warmth from the extremities, drawing all the body's resources inward to protect the vital organs that kept life itself flickering like a candle in the wind. Her wedding ring, once snug on her finger, now slipped and turned, her flesh having retreated from the persistent demand for sustenance that winter brought. The family's food stores, so carefully calculated in the autumn abundance, seemed to shrink with frightening speed. The grain barrels that had appeared so full after harvest now showed their wooden bottoms more clearly each day. The preserved meat, hanging in the cold shed attached to their cottage, had to be rationed with the precision of a miser counting coins. Every meal became a careful balance between present need and future survival. Jean rose before dawn each morning to check their supplies, running his hands through the remaining grain like a merchant assessing his wealth. The barley was holding well, and the dried peas would see them through if they were careful. But the bread, that staff of life that had sustained their family through gentler seasons, had become a precious commodity doled out in smaller and smaller portions. The children's eyes followed each loaf as Margot divided it, their young minds already learning the mathematics of scarcity that governed winter life. In the medieval world, winter hunger was not evenly distributed. The Lord's table still groaned under the weight of preserved delicacies, imported spices and wine that flowed like summer streams. The monastery's stores were deep and well managed, the brothers' careful planning and communal discipline ensuring that their community would survive even the harshest months. But in the cottages of the common folk, winter revealed the thin margin between survival and disaster that defined peasant existence. Little Pierre, barely 5 years old, had grown quiet in recent weeks, his usual chatter replaced by a solemn attention to the rituals of eating. He savoured each spoonful of soup as if it were a treasure, his small face serious with the understanding that food was not infinite, that winter demanded sacrifices from everyone, even children. His sister, Marie, older and more aware of their circumstances, helped her mother stretch their meals by gathering frozen berries from the hedgerows, her small hands growing red and numb as she searched for any supplement to their dwindling stores. Though hunger changed how time moved through their days. Meals became events of profound significance, anticipated and remembered with an intensity that would have seemed impossible in times of plenty. The morning portion of bread was eaten slowly, each bite chewed thoroughly, the taste held in the mouth as long as possible. The evening soup was savoured like a sacrament, its warmth spreading through bodies that had grown lean and sharp-angled with the season's demands. Margot found herself dreaming of food with a vividness that surprised her. In her sleep, she walked through summer gardens where vegetables hung heavy on the vine, where fruit trees dropped their bounty at her feet, where the streams ran thick with cream and honey flowed from every flower. She would wake from these dreams with tears on her cheeks, the contrast between the abundance of sleep and the reality of winter striking her heart like a physical blow. But the medieval hunger was more than physical deprivation. It was a teacher of profound lessons about the nature of existence itself. It taught the difference between want and need, between luxury and necessity. It revealed the profound gratitude that could be felt for a single egg, still warm from the hen, or a cup of milk that had not yet frozen in the pail. It showed how precious the simple act of chewing could become, how the body's basic functions could transform into celebrations of survival. The village baker, whose ovens had worked overtime during the abundant months, now baked smaller loaves, with flour that had been stretched with whatever he could find, ground acorns, dried beans, even sawdust when desperation demanded it. The bread was darker, denser, less satisfying than the white loaves of summer, but it sustained life, and for that it was received with gratitude that bordered on reverence. Jean's belt, notched tighter each week, told the story of winter's progression, as clearly as any calendar. His clothes hung looser on his frame, and when he looked in the small mirror of polished metal that had been his father's, he saw a face that had grown gaunt and sharp-featured, the skin drawn tight over bones that seemed closer to the surface than before. But his eyes still held the quiet determination that had carried his family through previous winters, the understanding that hunger was temporary, but surrender was permanent. The children adapted with the resilience of youth, finding games in their reduced circumstances, making entertainment from the simple act of warming their hands by the fire. They learned to appreciate tastes they had previously ignored. The bitter herbs that Margot gathered from beneath the snow, the thin broth made from bones that had been boiled multiple times, the satisfaction that came from a stomach that was not full but was no longer completely empty. In the evenings, when the family gathered around their fire, Margot would tell stories of legendary feasts, of tables that groaned under the weight of roasted meats and fresh bread, of celebrations where wine flowed freely and no one counted the cost of abundance. The children listened with wide eyes, these tales serving as both entertainment and promise, reminders that plenty existed somewhere in the world, that winter's grip was not permanent, that spring would eventually return with its gifts of renewed growth and harvest. The hunger that lived in their bones was patient and persistent, but it was not cruel. It taught them to value what they had, to waste nothing, to find nourishment not just in food, but in the warmth of companionship, the comfort of shared stories, the strength that came from facing hardship together. In the depth of winter's scarcity, they discovered riches that no amount of food could provide, the wealth of family, the abundance of love, the feast of simple survival in a world that demanded everything they had to give. In the medieval cottage, breath became a visible prayer, each exhalation creating small clouds that danced in the frigid air like incense offered to the gods of winter. Margot watched her children's breath bloom and fade as they slept. These gentle puffs of vapor, the only proof that life persisted in a world that seemed determined to freeze everything into crystalline stillness. The cold of medieval winter was not merely uncomfortable, it was a presence that transformed the very nature of being alive. Inside their cottage, despite the constantly tended fire, the temperature remained so low that water left in cups would develop a skin of ice by morning. The family's breath created its own weather system, condensing on the rough wooden walls and dripping down like tears shed by the house itself. Jean had learned to read the morning by the thickness of frost on the inside of their windows. When the ice patterns were delicate and lacy, the day might be manageable. When the frost was thick enough to scrape with his fingernail, he knew that venturing outside would require every layer of clothing they possessed, and even then might prove dangerous. The cold was not just weather, it was an adversary that demanded respect and careful strategy. The children's bodies had adapted to the persistent chill in ways that would have seemed impossible in warmer months. They learned to sleep curled into tight balls, conserving every bit of warmth their small frames could generate. Marie had developed the skill of breathing through her nose to warm the air before it reached her lungs, while little Pierre tucked his hands deep into his armpits, his body instinctively protecting its extremities from the cold's relentless assault. When the family spoke, their words came wrapped in visible clouds, making conversation seem like a sacred ritual where thoughts were made manifest in the air. The children delighted in this magic, sometimes speaking just to watch their breath bloom and dissipate, turning the harsh reality of cold into a source of wonder. They would compete to see whose breath lasted longest, whose cloud was thickest, finding games even in the midst of winter's severity. The medieval understanding of cold was deeply intertwined with their spiritual beliefs. The frigid air was seen as one of the four elements seeking balance, a force that needed to be respected rather than conquered. When Margot felt the cold seeping through the gaps in their walls, she often whispered prayers, asking not for warmth, but for the strength to endure, understanding that winter was part of the divine plan that governed all existence. Outside their cottage, the world had been transformed into something that seemed more like a fairy tale than reality. The bare branches of trees were encased in ice so thick they looked like crystal sculptures crafted by angels. Every surface sparkled with frost that caught and reflected what little light filtered through the grey winter sky. The beauty was breathtaking, but it was the beauty of a world that had become hostile to human life. The family's clothing had become their armor against the cold. Layer upon layer of wool and linen patched and repatched until the original fabric was barely visible beneath the repairs. Margot had sewn extra cloth into the lining of their garments, creating pockets of insulation that trapped warm air close to their bodies. Even indoors, they rarely removed more than their outer cloaks, understanding that maintaining body heat was easier than trying to generate it from nothing. Their morning routine had been completely transformed by winter's demands. Instead of rising with the sun, they waited for the fire to chase away some of the night's accumulated cold before leaving the warmth of their shared bed. Jean would rise first, his feet finding the wooden shoes he kept by the bedside, and carefully coaxed the banked coals back to flame. Only when the fire was crackling strongly would the rest of the family emerge from beneath their layers of woolen blankets. The kitchen work that had been simple in summer became elaborate productions requiring careful planning. Water for cooking had to be kept near the fire to prevent freezing, and Margot learned to work quickly when handling wet ingredients, knowing that her hands would grow numb within minutes of exposure to the cold. Even the act of kneading bread required strategy, working the dough near the fire's warmth, while trying not to let it rise too quickly in the uneven heat. The children's education continued even in winter's grip, but it too was transformed by the cold. Marie practiced her letters by drawing them in the frost on the windows, her small finger creating temporary writing that would melt and disappear, only to be reformed the next morning. Pierre learned to count by helping his father measure out their daily rations, the mathematics of survival becoming his earliest lessons in numbers and planning. At night, when the family gathered close to the fire, their breath created a small microclimate around them, a pocket of humid warmth that felt almost tropical compared to the harsh dryness of the winter air. They would sit so close to each other that their visible breaths merged into a single cloud, a family prayer made manifest in the sacred air of their humble home. The cold taught them things about their bodies they had never known. They learned that breath held not just life but warmth, that the act of speaking could be a way of sharing heat with those around them. They discovered that singing, despite making them colder, somehow made them stronger, the vibrations in their chests generating a different kind of warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the human spirit's refusal to surrender. Jean would sometimes stand at their door in the early morning, watching his breath disappear into the vast coldness of the winter landscape. In those moments, he felt both his own smallness in the face of winter's immensity and his own importance as a keeper of the flame that warmed his family's breath. Each exhalation was proof that they had survived another night. Each inhalation was hope that they would survive the day to come. As the fire settled into its evening glow and the family prepared for sleep, Margot would watch the gentle clouds of their breathing slow and steady, becoming the rhythm of dreams. In the morning, she knew, their breath would again be visible in the sacred air of winter, proof that love and determination could keep life flickering even in the coldest, darkest season that medieval England could conjure. The snow began to fall on the feast day of St. Nicholas, arriving not with the gentle flutter of early winter flakes, but with the determined intensity of a season that intended to stay. From their cottage window, Margot watched the world disappear, beneath a blanket that grew thicker with each passing hour, transforming the familiar landscape of their village into something alien and dreamlike. By morning, the snow had reached the windowsill, and still it continued to fall. Jean opened their door to find a wall of white that came up to his waist, the path to their animals' shelter completely erased. The weight of the snow pressed against their cottage walls with an almost audible sigh, as if the winter itself were settling down for a long, comfortable stay that might last until the world ended. The medieval mind understood snow differently than we do today. It was not merely frozen water, but a substance imbued with meaning, a manifestation of divine will that could either bless or curse according to heaven's mysterious plan. Some winters brought snow that insulated the earth like a gentle blanket, protecting the seeds that lay dormant beneath the soil. Other winters brought snow that killed, burying the world so deeply that spring seemed more like a fairy tale than a reasonable expectation. Little Pierre pressed his face against the glass, his breath fogging the cold surface as he stared at the endless white that stretched beyond his young imagination. The world he had known, the garden where he had played, the path to the church, the familiar shapes of neighboring cottages, had all vanished beneath the snow's relentless accumulation. To his 5-year-old mind, it seemed as if they had awakened in a different world entirely, one made of nothing but white silence and cold beauty. Marie, older and more practical, understood what the deep snow meant for their daily survival. The well, their source of water, would be buried and possibly frozen. The path to the church, where they received not just spiritual guidance, but news from the wider world, had become impassable. Most critically, the route to the Lord's Manor, where Jean sometimes found winter work that brought precious coins to supplement their meager stores, was now a treacherous journey that might take a man's life. The weight of the snow was not just physical, but psychological. Each flake that fell added to the growing sense of isolation that medieval winter imposed on rural communities. Villages that had been connected by well-traveled roads in summer became islands floating in an ocean of white, cut off from news, from trade, from the comfort of knowing that help existed somewhere beyond the horizon. Jean spent the morning digging a path to their animals, his breath coming in harsh puffs as he wrestled with snow that seemed to possess its own stubborn will. Each shovelful he moved appeared to be replaced by two more, as if the winter were mocking his efforts to maintain some semblance of control over his small domain. His back ached from the unfamiliar motion, and his hands grew numb despite the thick mittens Margot had knitted from their sheep's wool. The silence that came with deep snow was profound and unsettling. The usual sounds of village life, children playing, animals moving, the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer, were muffled into non-existence. The world had become wrapped in cotton, every sharp edge softened, every harsh sound absorbed into the gentle whisper of falling flakes. It was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, a quietness so complete it seemed to press against the eardrums like a physical presence. Inside the cottage, the family adapted to their new reality with the flexibility that medieval life demanded. Margot reorganized their daily routines around the snow's constraints, understanding that they might be confined to their small space for days or even weeks. She moved their essential supplies closer to the living area, knowing that the cold would make every journey to their storage areas an expedition requiring careful preparation. The children found wonder in their snowy prison, watching the way the limited light filtered through the white world outside their windows. The snow created its own luminescence, glowing with a pale blue light that seemed to emanate from within rather than being reflected from above. Marie traced patterns in the frost on the glass, creating temporary art that would melt and reform with the changing temperatures of their small home. But the weight of endless white carried darker implications for medieval families. Deep snow meant that hunting became nearly impossible, that gathering fuel required Herculean efforts, that the simplest tasks of daily survival became elaborate challenges requiring careful planning and considerable physical strength. Jean calculated and recalculated their stores, trying to determine how long they could remain isolated without facing genuine danger. The medieval understanding of snow included its capacity for both preservation and destruction. The cold kept their remaining meat fresh, acting as a natural refrigerator that could preserve food for months. But it also killed livestock that couldn't reach shelter, elderly neighbors who lacked sufficient fuel, children whose small bodies couldn't generate enough heat to survive the deep cold that accompanied heavy snowfall. Margot remembered the stories her grandmother had told of the terrible winter when she was young, when snow had fallen continuously for 40 days and nights. That winter, villages had disappeared completely beneath the white weight, only to be discovered months later when spring revealed cottages that had been crushed like eggshells beneath snow that had compressed into something approaching the density of stone. As evening approached, and the snow continued its relentless accumulation, the family gathered close to their fire, finding comfort in each other's warmth and presence. The children listened with wide eyes as Jean told stories of legendary winters, of heroes who had traveled through snow so deep that they walked on the tops of trees, of magical springs that had been found beneath the deepest drifts, the weight of endless white pressed down on their cottage like a physical presence, but inside their small circle of warmth and light, they maintained the stubborn human determination to find joy, even in the midst of winter's assault. They sang songs that their ancestors had sung through similar nights. They shared the simple food they had with gratitude for its sustenance, and they held each other close against the cold that waited just beyond their walls. Outside, the snow continued to fall with patient persistence, adding its weight to the already heavy burden that winter had placed upon their world. But inside, surrounded by love and warmed by their small fire, the family held fast to the knowledge that spring would eventually return, that the weight of endless white was temporary, and that human warmth could outlast even the deepest, coldest accumulation that the medieval winter could conjure. In the depths of winter, when the cold pressed against their cottage walls like a living creature seeking entry, fire transformed from a convenience into the very essence of survival itself. Margot tended their hearth with the devotion of a nun, maintaining the eternal flame in a cathedral, understanding that this dancing warmth represented the thin line between life and the endless cold that waited just beyond their door. The medieval relationship with fire was intimate and complex, born of absolute dependence and seasoned with profound respect. Every flame was precious because fuel was finite, carefully hoarded through the abundant months and parceled out with miserly precision when winter's grip tightened around their world. The woodpile that had seemed so substantial in autumn now appeared disturbingly small, each log representing warmth that could not be replaced until spring allowed travel to the distant forests. Jean rose each morning, while the family still slept, to perform the sacred ritual of coaxing life back into the banked coals. With patient breath and carefully placed kindling, he would nurse the embers back to flame, his success measured not just in heat, but in the continuation of their survival. A fire that died completely in the night could mean death for a medieval family, especially when fuel was scarce and the means to relight it uncertain. The children had learned to read their father's face during these morning ceremonies, understanding that his expression as he worked with the coals would determine the character of their entire day. When the fire caught quickly and burned bright, smiles would bloom on their young faces. When Jean struggled with damp wood or stubborn embers, they would grow quiet and serious, already calculating the implications of precious fuel wasted on a fire that refused to cooperate. Every scrap of combustible material became valuable beyond its apparent worth. Margot saved the fat from their meager meat supplies, using it to make rushlights that could provide hours of illumination. Old rags were soaked in animal fat and twisted into primitive candles that burned with smoky flames, but gave both light and a small amount of heat. Even sawdust from Jean's woodworking was collected and mixed with fat to create fire starters that could coax reluctant flames from the dampest kindling. The fire's warmth created invisible territories within their cottage, zones of comfort that diminished with mathematical precision as distance from the hearth increased. The family learned to arrange their lives within these thermal boundaries, understanding that moving too far from the fire meant entering a realm where breath became visible and fingers grew numb within minutes. Their entire living space contracted around the fire's influence, making their already small cottage feel even more confined. Little Pierre had appointed himself the family's woodchip collector, his small hands perfect for gathering the splinters and bark fragments that could extend the life of their precious fuel. He took his responsibilities seriously, crawling under benches and into corners to retrieve every combustible scrap, his young mind already understanding that wastefulness in winter was not just foolish, but potentially fatal. Marie helped her mother prepare the evening meal over their precious fire, learning to cook with the efficiency that medieval life demanded. Every flame had to serve multiple purposes: heating the cottage, cooking their food, providing light for necessary tasks, and warming water for the basic hygiene that helped prevent the diseases that could turn a hard winter into a deadly one. The art of medieval cooking was inseparable from the art of fire management. The quality of their fire told the story of their resources with brutal honesty. When they had good, dry wood, the flames danced high and bright, filling their cottage with warmth and cheerful light. When they were reduced to burning green wood or furniture that could be spared, the fire smouldered reluctantly, producing more smoke than heat, and filling their eyes with tears that had nothing to do with emotion. Margot remembered her mother's stories of the great fires that had warmed the Lord's Hall during winter celebrations, flames so large and abundant that servants could stand 10 feet away and still feel their heat. Those fires consumed more wood in a single evening than her family would use in a month, a display of wealth that seemed almost obscene when measured against their own careful rationing of every stick and splinter. The psychological importance of fire went beyond its practical necessity. In the long darkness of medieval winter, the dancing flames provided entertainment, comfort, and a focal point for family life. The children would stare into the fire and see faces in the flames, stories in the shifting patterns of light and shadow. Adults found meditation in the hypnotic dance of combustion, their minds settling into the peaceful rhythm that fire provided. But fire was also a teacher of harsh lessons about the nature of existence itself. It showed them that beauty and destruction were often identical, that the same flames that warmed their bodies could consume their entire world if given the chance. The medieval peasant lived with the constant awareness that fire was both savior and potential destroyer, requiring constant vigilance and respect. The evening ritual of banking the fire for the night was performed with ceremonial care. Jean would arrange the coals and ashes in patterns passed down through generations, techniques that would keep the fire alive but controlled through the dangerous hours of sleep. Too much air and the fire would consume their fuel too quickly. Too little and the flames would die, leaving them to face the morning cold with the difficult task of starting from nothing. As the family settled around their fire on this cold winter evening, they shared the warmth that had become more precious than any treasure the world could offer. The flames, reflected in their eyes, spoke of survival, of human determination, of the ancient partnership between fire and civilization that had made life possible in even the harshest conditions. In the dancing light of their hearth, they found not just warmth but hope, not just survival but the continuation of the human story through another long winter night. And as you listen to this tale of fire and survival, perhaps you too can feel the warmth that comes not from flames, but from the knowledge that human ingenuity and love have always found ways to create light in the darkest seasons, to kindle hope when hope seems impossible, to tend the fires of community and family that burn brighter than any hearth. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the cottage lay wrapped in winter's cold embrace, Margot would wake to the sound of her children's hungry stomachs speaking their own ancient language. The soft growls and gentle complaints of empty bellies created a symphony of need that no mother could ignore, a reminder that survival in medieval winter required miracles performed daily with the most ordinary ingredients. The family's morning meal had been reduced to its essential elements: a piece of bread no larger than a child's palm, carefully divided so that each person received exactly their fair share, and a cup of weak ale that provided both liquid and the small amount of nutrition that remained after the brewing process. Margot watched her children eat with the slow deliberation that hunger teaches, each bite chewed thoroughly, each swallow savored like a sacrament. Medieval hunger was not the sharp pang of a missed meal, but a constant companion that colored every thought, every decision, every dream. It changed the way colors appeared, making even the gray winter light seem too bright. It altered the perception of time, making minutes stretch into hours when the next meal was still distant. It transformed the simple act of eating from casual consumption into a profound ritual of gratitude and hope. Little Pierre had developed the habit of holding his bread close to his nose before eating, breathing in the yeasty fragrance as if the smell itself could provide nourishment. His young body, growing despite the constraints of winter scarcity, demanded more food than their stores could provide, and Margot watched with quiet anguish as his small frame grew thinner with each passing week. Marie, more aware of their circumstances, had begun to eat even more slowly than before, sometimes taking so long with her portion that the bread grew hard in her small hands. She seemed to understand intuitively that extending the experience of eating could provide psychological nourishment that complemented the physical sustenance, that the act of consumption could be stretched to fill more of the empty hours between meals. The family's prayers before meals had taken on new intensity and meaning. Where once they had offered thanks from abundance, now they prayed from genuine need, their words carrying the weight of bodies that knew intimately the difference between satisfaction and survival. Jean's voice would grow husky with emotion. As he blessed their meager food, his gratitude as real and substantial as the bread they were about to share. Margot had become an artist of scarcity, able to transform the smallest amount of food into something that could sustain her family for another day. She saved every crumb that fell from their table, collecting them in a small bowl that would eventually become the foundation for a soup stretched with whatever vegetables remained in their stores. The bones from their Sunday meat were boiled, repeatedly, each time yielding a thinner but still nourishing broth that could warm empty stomachs and provide the illusion of fullness. The village baker, once generous with the small extra loaves he would give to children who helped sweep his shop, now weighed every ounce of flour with scales more precise than those used for gold. His own family's survival depended on careful calculation, and charity, however well-intentioned, had become a luxury that few could afford. The children learned to walk past his shop without looking, understanding that the sight of fresh bread would only make their own hunger more difficult to bear. In the long winter evenings when the family gathered around their fire, conversation often turned to food in ways that would have seemed obsessive in times of plenty. They would describe remembered meals with the detail that others reserved for great works of art, recalling not just the taste, but the texture, the aroma, the satisfaction that had once been taken for granted. These conversations served as both torture and comfort, reminding them of abundance while helping them endure its absence. Jean's belt, notched tighter each week, had become a calendar of their winter's progression. His work clothes hung loose on his diminished frame, and when he caught his reflection in their small mirror, he saw a face that had grown sharp and angular, the soft fullness of summer health replaced by the lean geometry of winter survival. but his eyes still held the quiet determination that marked those who refused to surrender to circumstances beyond their control. The children's games had adapted to reflect their new reality. They played house with imaginary feasts, describing elaborate meals that existed only in their hungry imaginations. They took turns being the cook in a great lord's kitchen, pretending to prepare banquets that would feed hundreds of guests. These games served as both escape and preparation, helping them maintain hope while developing the mental resilience that winter survival required. Margot's dreams had become vivid landscapes of food, gardens where vegetables grew to impossible sizes, orchards where fruit hung so heavy that branches touched the ground, streams that flowed with milk and honey. She would wake from these dreams with tears on her cheeks, the contrast between sleeping abundance and waking scarcity striking, her heart like a physical blow. But she learned to transform even this pain into fuel for her determination to see her family through to spring. The village itself had grown quieter as winter progressed, the usual sounds of daily life muffled not just by snow, but by the collective effort to conserve energy. People moved more slowly, spoke more softly, laughed less frequently. The hunger had become a shared experience that bound the community together in mutual understanding, creating a fellowship of endurance that transcended the usual social boundaries. As the evening meal approached, the family would gather around, their small table with the solemnity of communicants approaching an altar. The food they shared was simple, perhaps a soup of dried peas and herbs, a small piece of preserved meat, bread that had been carefully rationed to last another day, but it was received with gratitude that transformed the humble meal into something approaching the sacred. The silent prayers of empty stomachs rose like incense in their small cottage, wordless petitions for strength to endure, for wisdom to stretch their resources, for the grace to find joy even in the midst of want. These prayers required no formal words, no ritualized gestures. They were written in the language of love that motivated every careful division of food, every sacrifice made so that the weakest members of the family might have a little more. In the dancing light of their fire, as the family shared their evening meal, Margot understood that they were participating in an ancient ritual of survival. Countless generations before them had sat around similar fires, had divided similar meals with the same careful precision, had offered the same silent prayers for strength to see another dawn. The hunger that gnawed at their stomachs was temporary, but the love that motivated their sharing was eternal. The empty bowls that remained after their meal were not symbols of deprivation, but evidence of their continued existence, proof that they had found a way to transform scarcity into sustenance, want into hope. Tomorrow would bring the same challenges, the same careful calculations, the same silent prayers of empty stomachs. But tonight, warmed by their fire and surrounded by love, they had everything they truly needed. In the grey light of winter morning, Margot's hands told the story of the season's progression with brutal honesty. Her fingers, once supple and quick at their household tasks, had become stiff and clumsy, moving with the careful deliberation of tools that could no longer be trusted to perform their work without conscious effort. The cold had settled into her joints like an unwelcome tenant, making every simple task an exercise in patience and determination. She flexed her fingers slowly before beginning her morning work, a ritual that had become as necessary as prayer. The joints protested with small pops and aches, reminders that the human body was not designed to endure the relentless assault of medieval winter. But her hands also held memories, phantom sensations of summer warmth that seemed to flicker just beneath the surface like coals buried deep in ash that might yet be coaxed back to flame. Jean's hands bore the winter's marks differently, his calluses having grown thicker and harder, creating a natural armor against the cold. But even his weathered palms showed the stress of the season, with cracks and splits that refused to heal in the dry, frigid air. He wrapped his hands in strips of cloth before venturing outside, understanding that exposed skin could freeze in minutes during the coldest days. The children's small hands were perhaps the most vulnerable, their delicate skin turning red and then white with alarming speed when exposed to the winter air. Margot had knitted mittens for them from their sheep's wool, but even these provided only temporary protection against cold that seemed determined to penetrate every barrier they could devise. She watched them constantly for signs of frostbite, the white patches that could appear without warning and steal away sensation permanently. Little Pierre had developed the habit of tucking his hands deep into his armpits, his small body instinctively seeking the warmth that his torso could provide. His fingers, when he finally extracted them to eat or help with simple tasks, would be so stiff that he needed several minutes to regain enough dexterity to hold a spoon or cup. The sight of his struggle filled Margot with fierce protectiveness and quiet despair in equal measure. Marie's hands had learned to work despite the cold, her young fingers developing the muscle memory that allowed her to help with cooking and sewing even when she could barely feel her fingertips. She had become expert at working close to the fire, using the warmth to maintain just enough sensation to thread a needle or stir a pot. Her small palms had grown rough from constant exposure to the harsh conditions, developing their own protective layer against the winter's assault. The medieval understanding of cold's effect on the body was limited but practical. They knew that warming frozen fingers too quickly could cause pain and damage, so they had developed techniques for gradual restoration of circulation. Margot would have the children cup their hands around a warm bowl of water, slowly increasing the temperature until sensation returned. The process was often painful, accompanied by tears that had nothing to do with emotion and everything to do with the body's protest against winter's cruelty. Work that had been simple in summer became elaborate challenges requiring careful planning and frequent breaks. Margot's sewing, once a source of both necessity and pleasure, now required strategic positioning near the fire and frequent pauses to warm her stiffened fingers. The stitches that had once been tiny and precise became larger and less even, but they still served their purpose, holding together the garments that kept her family warm. The family's morning routine had been restructured around the need to restore circulation to hands that had grown numb during the night. They would begin each day by holding their palms close to the fire, flexing their fingers and rubbing their hands together to encourage blood flow. This ritual had become as important as their morning prayers, a necessary preparation for the day's work that lay ahead. Jean's outdoor work had become a careful balance between necessity and the limits of human endurance. He could only spend short periods outside before his hands became too numb to grip his tools safely. The axe that had felt light in his summer grip now seemed unwieldy in winter-stiffened fingers, and he had learned to work in brief bursts, returning frequently to the cottage to warm his hands before frostbite could claim them. The children found games even in their discomfort, comparing whose fingers had turned the most interesting shade of red or blue, competing to see who could maintain sensation longest in the cold air. These games served a practical purpose, teaching them to monitor their bodies for signs of dangerous cold exposure while transforming potential fear into manageable play. At night, the family would warm their hands one final time before sleep, holding them close to the dying fire and sharing the heat between family members. Margot would rub her children's small hands between her own, trying to transfer what warmth she possessed to protect them through the long, cold hours ahead. Jean would massage his wife's aching joints, his own stiff fingers working to ease the pain that winter had settled into her bones. The memory of warmth became a form of wealth more precious than gold. Margot would sometimes hold her hands cupped as if they contained summer sunshine, trying to recreate the sensation of warm earth between her fingers or the feel of sun-heated fabric fresh from the drying line. These phantom sensations provided psychological comfort even when they couldn't deliver physical relief, reminders that winter's grip was temporary and that warmth still existed somewhere in the world. The village blacksmith shop had become a gathering place not for commerce, but for the simple human need to warm frozen hands around his forge. Even when he had no work to offer, he would allow villagers to stand near his fire for a few precious minutes, understanding that the ability to move their fingers might mean the difference between survival and disaster for families struggling through the harsh season. As evening approached and the family settled around their fire, they would hold their hands toward the flames like supplicants, making offerings to benevolent gods. The warmth that reached their fingers was both physical comfort and spiritual sustenance, a reminder that humans had always found ways to create warmth in the coldest seasons, to kindle hope when hope seemed impossible. Their hands, marked by winter's harsh passage, told the story of their determination to survive. Every crack and callus, every stiff joint and numbed fingertip bore witness to their refusal to surrender to the season's demands. In the gentle light of their evening fire, their fingers finally found the warmth they had been seeking all day, and for a few precious hours they could remember what it felt like to be truly warm. Winter in medieval times spoke its own language, one written in the creak of frozen timbers, the whisper of snow against window shutters, and the thousand small signals that meant the difference between life and death for those who had learned to listen. Margot and her family had become fluent in this harsh tongue, their survival depending on their ability to read the subtle messages that winter sent to those who paid attention. The sound of the wind told stories more precise than any book. When it howled around the corners of their cottage with a rising pitch, Jean knew that the temperature was dropping dangerously and that their animals would need extra protection through the night. When it whispered softly under the eaves, carrying with it the scent of snow, Margot understood that another storm was approaching and that she should check their supplies once more before the weather made venturing outside impossible. The cottage itself spoke constantly, its wooden frame expanding and contracting with changes in temperature and humidity. The sharp crack that sometimes split the silence of winter nights meant that the frost had penetrated deeper into their walls, while the gentle groaning that accompanied the wind warned of structural stress that might require attention when spring finally allowed repairs. Jean had learned to interpret these sounds like a physician reading symptoms, understanding which noises meant immediate danger and which were simply the building's way of adapting to winter's pressure. Little Pierre had developed an uncanny ability to predict the weather by watching the behavior of their animals. When the chickens huddled together more closely than usual, refusing to venture outside their shelter, even for food, he knew that a severe cold spell was approaching. When the cow stood facing away from the wind with her ears flattened, he understood that the weather was about to turn dangerous for anyone caught outside without proper protection. Marie had learned to read the language of smoke, understanding that the way their chimney drew air could predict changes in the weather hours before. They became apparent in other ways. When the smoke rose straight and tall, the weather would remain stable. When it was blown back down the chimney or swirled in complex patterns, She knew that storms were coming that would test their family's preparation and endurance. The quality of light filtering through their small windows told Margot everything she needed to know about the day's possibilities. The grey, flat illumination that accompanied heavy snow meant that outdoor work would be impossible and that they should conserve their energy for essential tasks. The brilliant, almost painful brightness that reflected off fresh snow warned of temperatures so low that exposed skin could freeze in minutes. Even their food spoke its own language of preservation and deterioration. The way their bread felt in her hands told Margot how much moisture remained in the cottage's air. The sound that their stored grain made when stirred revealed whether it was staying dry or beginning to develop the dampness that could lead to spoilage. The color of their preserved meat indicated whether it was remaining safe to eat or beginning the dangerous transformation that could poison the entire family. Jean had learned to interpret the language of his own body with scientific precision. The particular ache in his joints that warned of approaching storms, the way his scars from old injuries became more painful when the temperature was about to drop dramatically, the subtle changes in his breathing that indicated when the air was becoming too cold for extended outdoor work. His body had become his most reliable weather instrument, more accurate than any device the medieval world could provide. The children's sleep patterns spoke volumes about their physical condition
and the cottage's environment.
When they slept restlessly, tossing and turning despite their exhaustion, Margot knew that they were either too cold or beginning to show signs of the winter illnesses that could claim young lives so quickly. When they slept deeply and peacefully, she understood that their small bodies were successfully adapting to the challenges that winter imposed. The village around them added its voice to winter's conversation. The sound of other families' morning routines, the scrape of snow being cleared from doorways, the crack of axes splitting frozen wood, the distant lowing of cattle being fed, told the story of the community's collective struggle. When these sounds became less frequent or stopped entirely, it often meant that illness or disaster had struck another household, information that could be crucial for mutual aid and survival. The language of scarcity spoke in mathematical terms that every member of the family understood without formal education. The rate at which their woodpile diminished told them how many more weeks they could maintain their current level of warmth. The way their grain barrel felt when Jean reached to the bottom spoke of whether their food stores would last until spring. Planting made fresh supplies possible. The thickness of the ice on their water bucket revealed how much extra fuel would be needed to provide liquid for drinking and cooking. Even the quality of silence carried meaning in winter's vocabulary. The muffled quiet that accompanied heavy snowfall meant that the world outside had become dangerous for travel, while the sharp, brittle silence of clear, cold nights warned of temperatures that could kill the unprepared. The family had learned to listen not just to sounds, but to the absence of sound, understanding that winter's quietest moments were often its most dangerous. Margot's hands had become instruments for reading winter's language through touch. The way fabric felt when she handled it told her how much moisture remained in their cottage's air. The texture of her children's skin revealed whether they were maintaining adequate nutrition and warmth. The feel of their bedding each morning indicated whether they had successfully retained heat through the night or were losing the battle against winter's relentless assault. As the family gathered around their fire each evening, they would unconsciously share the day's translations of winter's messages. Jean might mention the way the animals had behaved, warning of weather changes to come. Margot would report on the condition of their supplies, using the language of careful measurement that meant survival. The children would add their own observations, their young senses often detecting changes that adult preoccupations might miss. The language of survival was not learned from books, but from the accumulated wisdom of generations who had faced similar challenges. It was passed down through quiet conversations by firelight, through the example of parents who understood that teaching their children to read winter's signs was as important as teaching them to read words on a page. This knowledge, written in the grammar of endurance and the vocabulary of hope, would serve them not just through this winter, but through all the winters yet to come. In the depths of winter's grip, when the world outside their cottage had been transformed into an endless landscape of white and grey, Margot found herself dreaming in colours that seemed impossible in their current reality. Her sleeping mind painted vivid pictures of summer meadows where flowers bloomed in shades so brilliant they made her wake with tears on her cheeks, as if her soul were mourning the absence of beauty that winter had stolen from their world. The children's dreams had become their escape from the harsh realities of their daily existence. Little Pierre would wake speaking of gardens where vegetables grew as tall as trees, where he could walk through forests of beans and climb mountains made of fresh bread. His young imagination, undaunted by winter's severity, continued to create worlds where abundance was possible and hunger was just a word without meaning. Marie dreamed of dresses made from flower petals, of shoes woven from grass, of hair ribbons that sang like birds when the wind touched them. In her dreams, she danced through meadows where the ground was soft and warm beneath her feet, where the air smelled of honey and roses instead of smoke and cold stone. She would wake from these dreams with a smile that gradually faded as the grey reality of winter reasserted itself around her. Jean's dreams were more practical, but no less poignant. He found himself working in fields where the earth was dark and rich, where his plough moved easily through soil that welcomed the seeds he scattered behind him. In these sleeping visions, his back was straight and strong, his hands steady and sure, and the sun warmed his shoulders as he worked. The ache in his joints would seem to ease during these dreams, as if his body remembered what it felt like to be healthy and strong. The family would sometimes share their dreams during the long winter evenings, their voices soft and wistful as they described the worlds their sleeping minds had created. These conversations became a form of entertainment more precious than any minstrel's song, filling their cottage with images of beauty and abundance that sustained their spirits when physical comfort was scarce. Margot's garden dreams were so vivid she could almost taste the herbs she had grown in summers past. She would dream of running her hands through beds of mint and thyme, of picking tomatoes still warm from the sun, of gathering flowers that filled her arms with fragrance that seemed more real than the smoky air of their winter cottage. In these dreams, her children's faces were round and healthy, their laughter carrying across fields green with growing things. The medieval understanding of dreams gave them special significance during the harsh winter months. Dreams were seen as messages from the divine, glimpses of paradise that reminded the faithful that suffering was temporary and joy was eternal. When Margot woke from dreams of green meadows and flowing streams, she interpreted them as promises that spring would return, that God had not forgotten the world beneath winter's harsh rule. The children had begun to draw their dreams in the ashes of their hearth, using sticks to create pictures of the beautiful worlds they visited in sleep. Their artwork was temporary, erased each morning when the fire was rebuilt, but the act of creation seemed to make their dreams more real, more sustaining. Marie drew flowers with petals that curled and twisted in impossible ways, while Pierre created animals that were part horse, part bird, all magic. Even the village priest, when families could make their way to church through the snow, spoke of dreams as gifts from heaven. He encouraged his parishioners to hold fast to their visions of beauty and abundance, understanding that these mental images were often the only thing that stood between hope and despair during the longest, coldest months of the year. The contrast between their dreams and their waking reality was sometimes almost unbearable. To wake from visions of endless green meadows to find the world outside still locked in winter's grey embrace required a particular kind of courage that medieval people had to develop simply to survive. Yet they learned to use this contrast as motivation, treating their dreams as previews of the future rather than mere escapes from the present. Margot began to plan her actual garden based on her winter dreams, using the long evenings to imagine where she would plant each herb, each vegetable, each flower when spring finally returned. The mental act of garden planning became a form of prayer, a declaration of faith that warm weather would eventually arrive and that life would begin again. She would describe her plans to the children, painting word pictures of the abundance they would create together. The family's shared dreaming became a way of storing hope for the future. When Jean described his dreams of strong horses pulling plows through fertile soil, he was not just escaping from winter's hardships, but preparing mentally for the work that spring would bring. When the children spoke of playing in fields of flowers, they were maintaining the emotional connections that would help them appreciate beauty when it returned to their world. Sometimes their dreams would blend together during the long nights, creating family visions of shared abundance and joy. They would find themselves in the same imaginary meadows, working together in gardens that stretched beyond the horizon, celebrating harvests that could feed entire villages. These shared dreams strengthened the bonds between them, creating a common vision of the future that sustained them through present hardships. The winter world outside their windows seemed to mock their colorful dreams with its relentless monotony of white and grey. But inside their cottage, surrounded by love and warmed by their small fire, the family understood that dreams were not fantasies, but necessities, not escapes, but preparations. Their sleeping minds were rehearsing for the life that would return, with spring keeping alive the knowledge of beauty and abundance that winter seemed determined to erase. As the long night settled around their cottage and the family prepared for sleep, they carried with them the quiet anticipation of the dreams that awaited. In a few hours, their minds would once again paint the world in impossible colors, would show them visions of plenty that made endurance possible. Tomorrow they would wake to winter's continued grip, but tonight they would walk in gardens where green was the only color that mattered, and hope grew as abundantly as flowers in eternal spring. In the grey hour before sunrise, when the world balanced on the knife's edge between night and day, Margot stood at her cottage window and watched for the signs that had sustained her family through the longest winter of their lives. There, in the barely perceptible changes that marked each dawn's arrival, lay the ancient promise that had kept human hearts beating through countless seasons of darkness and cold. The light came differently now than it had in the depths of December, where once the sun had seemed reluctant to show itself, rising late and setting early like a visitor who could not wait to leave. Now it lingered just a moment longer each day. The change was so subtle that only those who had learned to measure hope in minutes could detect it. But to Margot's winter-weary eyes, each additional moment of daylight was a gift more precious than gold. Jean felt it in his bones before his mind recognized what was happening. The same joints that had predicted storms and temperature drops now spoke of subtle shifts in the great wheel of seasons. The ache that had settled into his back during the worst weeks of winter seemed fractionally less severe, as if his body somehow knew that the earth was beginning its slow turn toward renewal, even though snow still covered the ground and ice still claimed the streams. Little Pierre noticed it first in the behavior of their animals. The chickens, who had huddled in sullen misery through the coldest months, now showed brief moments of activity that suggested some deep instinct was stirring within them. The cow's milk, which had decreased to barely a cup each day, showed signs of slowly increasing production. Even their old horse, who had seemed ready to surrender to winter's final claim, lifted his head with something approaching interest when Jean brought the morning feed. Marie discovered the promise in the qualities of light that filtered through their small windows. The harsh, flat illumination of deep winter was beginning to show hints of the golden warmth that she remembered from better days. When she held her hand up to catch the morning sun, she could almost feel a different kind of heat trying to penetrate. The cold glass, a warmth that spoke of life returning to a world that had seemed permanently frozen. The village around them was beginning to show similar signs of awakening. The smoke that rose from cottage chimneys seemed to climb more eagerly toward the sky, as if even the fires were responding to some invisible change in the air. The paths between houses, worn down to ice by months of careful foot traffic, showed patches where the relentless cold was beginning to lose its grip on the earth beneath. Margot had begun to notice birds that she had not seen since autumn's end. Not the hardy crows and sparrows that had shared their winter struggle, but smaller, more delicate creatures that appeared for brief moments before vanishing again into whatever shelter they had found. Their presence was fleeting, easily missed, but to eyes that had learned to read the subtle language of hope, these brief appearances were announcements that better days were written somewhere in the future. The family's morning prayers had begun to carry different inflections, subtle changes in tone that reflected their growing awareness that survival was becoming certainty rather than daily struggle. Where their winter supplications had focused on strength to endure, their dawn devotions now included tentative expressions of gratitude for what seemed to be coming rather than what had already passed. Jean's daily inspection of their supplies had taken on a different character. Where once he had calculated with the grim precision of a man expecting disaster, he now counted with the cautious optimism of someone who dared to believe that their stores might actually last until spring made new provisions possible. The grain barrel that had seemed to empty so quickly now appeared to be diminishing at a sustainable rate. The woodpile, though smaller than he would have liked, might just see them through to the time when fuel could be gathered from forests that were no longer locked in winter's grip. The children's games had begun to include preparations for spring activities that had seemed impossible just weeks before. They spoke of gardens they would plant, of games they would play in warm sunshine, of the simple joy of being outside without layers of protective clothing. Their planning was tentative, as if they feared that speaking too boldly of spring might somehow prevent its arrival, but their voices carried unmistakable notes of anticipation. Even their dreams had begun to change, becoming less desperate escapes from harsh reality and more like actual previews of possibilities that might soon become real. Margot found herself dreaming not of impossible gardens filled with magical abundance, but of realistic plots where ordinary vegetables grew in ordinary soil, warmed by an ordinary sun that chose to stay in the sky for reasonable periods of time. The family's evening conversations around their fire had shifted from mere survival planning to discussions of what they would do when better weather returned. These talks were still cautious, hedged with the qualifications that medieval life demanded, but they were fundamentally different from the grim calculations that had characterized their darkest weeks. Margot began to prepare in small ways for the season that was surely coming. She sorted through the seeds she had saved from the previous year's garden, checking them for viability and planning where each variety would be planted when the soil finally thawed. The act of handling these small promises of future abundance filled her with quiet joy that seemed almost dangerous in its intensity. The light that grew stronger each day was not just illumination, but revelation, showing the family that they had successfully navigated the worst that winter could offer, and emerged with their love intact, their determination unbroken, and their hope not just preserved but strengthened by the ordeal they had shared. Every dawn now carried within it the whispered promise that human endurance, sustained by love and faith, could outlast even the cruelest season. As the family settled into their bed of straw for another night, they carried with them the knowledge that each sleep brought them closer to the morning when they would wake to find winter's grip finally broken. The promise hidden in every dawn was not just of spring's eventual arrival, but of their own capacity to survive, to hope, to find joy, even in the midst of hardship. In the growing light of this particular morning, as birdsong began to return to the world and the sun climbed just a little higher than it had the day before, Margot understood that they had witnessed one of humanity's most ancient triumphs. The victory of endurance over despair, of love over hardship, of hope over the longest night. Spring would come, as it always had, as it always would, and they would be there to welcome it with hearts that had been strengthened rather than broken by winter's test. The promise hidden in every dawn was simple but profound, that no night lasts forever, that no winter claims eternal dominion, that the human spirit, nurtured by love and sustained by hope, can outlast any darkness the world can conjure. As you drift towards sleep, carry with you this ancient promise that morning always comes, that spring always returns, and that hope, however fragile it might seem, burns with a flame that no amount of cold can extinguish. Rest now in the knowledge that dawn is always just a few hours away, bringing with it the gift of another day, another chance, another opportunity to discover that survival itself is a form of victory, and that love shared makes even the harshest winter a season that can be endured with grace.